For a few seconds on a red carpet, Meghan Markle appeared to reach toward David Foster. But instead of stopping, David seemed to walk straight past her. Then he smiled toward Prince Harry, and almost instantly, the internet had its story. Meghan had been publicly snubbed. But there was a problem with that viral interpretation. David Foster later offered an explanation that completely changed the picture. And just when it looked like the controversy was over, another moment involving Katharine McPhee put Meghan back at the center of the discussion. So what really happened? Was Meghan actually ignored? Or did a few seconds of chaotic red carpet footage create a story that wasn't really there? Tonight, we're breaking down the footage, David's explanation, and the awkward Katharine McPhee moment that changed everything. For a few seconds on a red carpet, Meghan Markle appeared to reach toward David Foster, and David seemed to walk straight past her. Then he smiled toward Prince Harry. That was all it took. Almost immediately, the internet had a story. Meghan had been snubbed. David Foster had ignored her. Harry got the warm reaction, while Meghan appeared to be left standing there. The footage looked awkward, and once the clip began circulating, people started doing what social media does best: slowing the moment down, freezing individual frames, analyzing every movement, and trying to figure out what happened between the people involved. But there was a problem with the viral interpretation. The footage showed what happened visually. It did not show what anyone was thinking. And when David Foster's explanation entered the conversation, the original story suddenly became much less straightforward. According to the explanation referenced in the original discussion, David had already greeted Harry and Meghan earlier. He was not deliberately refusing to acknowledge them. He was moving through a crowded red carpet environment, focusing on the people and photographers directly in front of him. If that account is accurate, then the viral claim that David intentionally humiliated Meghan becomes much harder to defend. But strangely enough, that did not end the controversy. It created another question, because when viewers went back to the footage, they began noticing something else. Katharine McPhee, David Foster's wife, appeared nearby, and for a brief moment, Meghan's movement seemed to place her directly in the middle of the interaction. Katharine was partially obscured. Meghan appeared to gesture toward David, and suddenly, the story was no longer simply about whether David had ignored Meghan. Now people were asking what Meghan was actually doing in that moment. Was she simply helping organize the group for photographs? Was she pointing David toward the photographers? Was everyone just moving around at the same time? Or did the interaction genuinely look awkward enough to raise questions? Tonight, we're going to break down exactly why this tiny red carpet moment became such a big discussion, what David Foster's explanation changes, what the footage can actually tell us, and where online speculation goes beyond the evidence. Because there is a very important difference between saying a moment looks awkward and claiming that we know exactly why it happened. And in this case, that difference matters. Let's start with the moment that caused all the attention. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry were attending an event where David Foster and Katharine McPhee were also present. The cameras were already active. People were gathering. Photographers were calling guests into position. And in the middle of all that movement came a few seconds that looked surprisingly dramatic when isolated. Meghan appeared to extend her arm toward David Foster. David continued moving. He then appeared beside Harry, and his expression looked warmer in that particular frame. If you freeze the footage at exactly the right second, the story seems obvious. Meghan reaches toward David. David walks past. Then David smiles toward Harry. That sequence creates a very simple narrative. But red carpet footage is rarely that simple. A red carpet is not a normal conversation between two people standing alone in a quiet room. There can be photographers calling from several directions. People can be moving into different positions. Guests can already have greeted one another moments before the cameras capture them. And a gesture that looks like a greeting can actually be a direction toward a photographer or another person. The camera captures movement. It does not capture intention. That is the first thing to remember, because once a short clip becomes viral, viewers often unconsciously fill in the missing information. They see David walk past Meghan, so they assume he ignored her. They see him smile toward Harry, so they assume he preferred Harry. They see Meghan's arm move, so they assume she was trying to get David's attention. But none of those assumptions automatically follows from the footage. They are interpretations, and that distinction became especially important when David Foster's explanation was brought into the discussion. According to the account referenced in the original reporting, David was happy to see Harry and Meghan. The explanation was essentially that he had already greeted them and simply did not see them at that exact point on the carpet in the way viewers assumed. That changes the entire framing. If David had already said hello earlier, then he did not necessarily have any reason to stop and repeat the greeting when the cameras happened to capture him moving toward the group. And suddenly, the supposed snub becomes much less dramatic. This is why context matters. Imagine watching a 10-second clip of two friends at a party. One person walks past. So, was David Foster deliberately snubbing Meghan? Based on the explanation presented, there is not enough evidence to make that claim. And that is an important correction to the viral version of the story. But there is still another reason people kept talking, because the footage involving Katharine McPhee added a completely different layer. Katharine was not a random guest. She is David Foster's wife, and she has her own connection with Meghan. The two women have previously been associated within the same social circle, including discussions about their earlier connection. David Foster, meanwhile, had also been linked socially with Harry and Meghan during their time in Canada. That background is why viewers paid so much attention to what otherwise might have been an ordinary red carpet movement. People already knew there was history between the individuals involved, so when the four of them appeared together, every gesture suddenly became interesting. And then came the moment that viewers started replaying. Meghan moved toward David. Her arm crossed the space between them. Katharine appeared partly behind Meghan. The positioning looked awkward, but here is where we need to slow down. An awkward-looking frame is not automatically evidence of an awkward relationship. It could have been nothing more than timing. Maybe Meghan was trying to position David for the group photograph. Maybe she was pointing toward a photographer. Maybe David was moving toward the location where the photographers wanted him. Maybe Katharine shifted at the exact same moment. Maybe several people were reacting to different instructions simultaneously. All of those explanations are possible, and there is no clear evidence in the footage alone that tells us which one is correct. But because the moment looked unusual, critics immediately offered another interpretation. They questioned why Meghan appeared to move so directly into the space between David and Katharine. They questioned why Katharine became partially obscured, and they wondered whether Meghan was being overly controlling about the positioning. Again, those are interpretations. They are not established facts. There is an even more dramatic version of the speculation that is circulated around the people involved. Some viewers have tried to connect the footage to old rumors and suggest that Meghan's interaction with David looked unusually familiar or suggestive. But this is where we need to be very careful. A few seconds of body language cannot prove attraction. It cannot prove flirting. It cannot prove jealousy. It cannot prove a secret feud. And it certainly cannot establish a hidden relationship. Those conclusions require evidence that this footage simply does not provide. What the footage can show is positioning, movement, expressions, and timing. What it cannot show us with certainty is motive. That distinction is essential, and it is actually what makes this story more interesting, because the strongest version of the controversy is not that Meghan was caught doing something scandalous. There is not enough evidence for that. The stronger story is that a moment which initially appeared to make Meghan the victim of a public snub became, after further examination, a much more ambiguous situation. At first, the internet saw Meghan as the person being rejected. Then David's explanation challenged that interpretation, and suddenly viewers were examining Meghan's own movements instead. That is quite a reversal. The person who initially appeared to be the target of the awkward moment became the center of a new debate. And this is exactly how celebrity controversies evolve. One frame creates a theory. A new piece of information challenges the theory. Then another frame creates a completely different theory. Before long, the original event has almost disappeared. People are no longer asking what actually happened. They are arguing over which interpretation they prefer. And that is where this red carpet moment becomes a perfect example of the power of social media. Let's look at the first narrative again. David Foster snubbed Meghan. Why did people believe it? Because visually, the moment was easy to understand. Meghan appears to reach. David moves past. Harry receives a smile. The sequence can be explained in one sentence, and simple stories travel faster than complicated ones. But reality is usually more complicated. If David had already greeted Meghan and Harry, then the same footage can be understood completely differently. He was not necessarily ignoring Meghan. He was simply moving through the event. And that means the viral clip may have created a conclusion that the footage itself could never actually prove. This is a common problem with celebrity body language stories. People confuse appearance with intention. Someone looks uncomfortable, so they must be uncomfortable. Someone looks angry, so they must be angry. Someone does not make eye contact, so they must be avoiding another person. Someone smiles at one person and not another, so they must prefer that person. But human behavior does not work that neatly. People look away because they are distracted. They move because someone else is directing them. They smile because a photographer said something. They raise their hands because they are trying to communicate in a noisy environment. And sometimes people simply move at the wrong moment. That may be exactly what happened here. But then we have Katharine, and this is where the story becomes visually complicated. Katharine's position behind Meghan creates an image that looks more dramatic than the underlying interaction may actually have been. From one angle, it can look as though Meghan moved directly between David and his wife. From another perspective, it may simply look like four people trying to fit into a photograph. This is why the exact frame matters, and it is also why zooming in on a single frame can sometimes make a situation more misleading rather than more informative. When you freeze a moving scene, normal movement can suddenly look deliberate. A person's hand can appear to be pointing when they were simply moving it. Someone standing behind another person can look as though they were deliberately blocked. A smile can look directed at one specific person, even if the individual was actually looking toward a photographer. The still image removes the movement that explains the image. And that is the irony of this entire controversy. The more people freeze the footage, the less context they may actually have. Now, there is another factor that cannot be ignored. Meghan Markle is one of the most heavily scrutinized public figures in the world. Fairly or unfairly, her body language is constantly analyzed. Her expressions are analyzed. Her interactions with Harry are analyzed. Her interactions with celebrities are analyzed. Even where she stands in a photograph can become a discussion. That level of scrutiny changes the way people interpret ordinary behavior. If an unknown celebrity moved her arm toward another guest during a group photograph, most people would probably never notice. But because this was Meghan Markle, the gesture immediately became meaningful to millions of viewers. That creates a cycle. People expect something controversial. They watch more closely. They find an unusual movement. That movement becomes evidence for the narrative they already expected. Then the narrative encourages even more scrutiny. And eventually, completely ordinary behavior can become controversial simply because people are looking for something unusual. That does not mean every criticism of Meghan is unfair. It means that the evidence should be separated from the interpretation, and that is especially important here. There is evidence that David walked past Meghan in the footage. There is evidence that he later appeared to smile toward Harry. There is evidence that Meghan moved her arm. There is evidence that Katharine was partially obscured in the moment. But there is no direct evidence from this footage proving that David intended to humiliate Meghan. There is no direct evidence proving Meghan intended to block Katharine, and there is no direct evidence proving romantic or jealous feeling between any of the people involved. Those are conclusions people can speculate about, but they should not be presented as established fact. That distinction actually makes the story stronger, not weaker, because instead of forcing the audience to accept one dramatic interpretation, we can ask the more interesting question: what does the footage actually show? The answer is much more nuanced. It shows a busy red carpet environment. It shows people moving into position. It shows Meghan interacting in the same space as David and Katharine. It shows a moment that looks awkward when isolated, and it shows how quickly an ambiguous interaction can become a major online discussion. David Foster's explanation is therefore important. It does not magically tell us everything about the event, but it provides context that weakens the most dramatic accusation. If the greeting had already happened, then the idea of a deliberate public rejection becomes much less convincing. That does not mean everyone has to agree that the moment looked normal. People are allowed to say that the footage looked awkward. They are allowed to say the body language was strange. They are allowed to question why Katharine ended up behind Meghan. But there is a line between asking questions and claiming certainty, and this story crosses that line very easily. That is why the title and framing of a video about this moment matter. If the story is presented as David Foster humiliates Meghan Markle, then the audience is being told the conclusion before seeing the evidence. But a more accurate and potentially more intriguing framing is David Foster's Meghan Markle snub explained, but then Katharine McPhee changed everything. Now there is a mystery. The audience wants to know what happened. They want to know why the original snub theory may not be correct, and they want to know what the Katharine moment has to do with it. That creates curiosity without pretending that speculation is fact. And that is the approach this story really needs. Because the most fascinating part is not whether Meghan was definitely snubbed. The fascinating part is how quickly the interpretation changed. First, Meghan appeared to be the person being ignored. Then David's explanation challenged that. Then viewers noticed Katharine. Then the conversation shifted toward Meghan's behavior. And suddenly, the original story had become something completely different. This is why the moment continued to attract attention. It was ambiguous, and ambiguity is perfect fuel for online commentary. If the footage had clearly shown a confrontation, there would be no mystery. If David had obviously refused to speak to Meghan, there would be no debate. If Meghan had clearly explained what she was doing, there would be no speculation. Instead, we have a few seconds that can be interpreted in several ways. That means every viewer can bring their own assumptions to the footage. Some will see an innocent group photo moment. Others will see unnecessary awkwardness. Some will believe David's explanation completely. Others will remain skeptical. And some will connect the moment to old rumors involving the people involved. But the footage itself does not settle all of those questions. And perhaps that is the most important conclusion. Was Meghan Markle deliberately snubbed by David Foster? The available explanation makes that claim look much weaker than the viral clip initially suggested. Was Meghan simply directing people into position? That is certainly one plausible explanation. Was Katharine caught behind Meghan because of nothing more than timing? That is also entirely possible. Did the interaction look awkward? Yes, depending on the frame and the interpretation. But does the footage prove a secret feud, deliberate disrespect, flirting, jealousy, or anything more dramatic? No, and that is where responsible analysis has to stop. Because when celebrities are involved, there is always a temptation to turn every gesture into a clue. But sometimes a gesture is just a gesture. Sometimes a person walking past is simply walking past. Sometimes a person moving their arm is simply trying to communicate with a group. And sometimes a person happens to disappear behind another person at exactly the wrong moment for the cameras. That does not make the footage boring. In fact, it makes the story more interesting because it shows how perception works. One frame can make Meghan look rejected. Another can make her look like the person controlling the interaction. The same few seconds can produce two completely opposite narratives, and neither interpretation should automatically be treated as fact. There is also something almost ironic about the entire situation. The event itself was supposed to be about something much more important than a few seconds of celebrity body language. There were charitable elements, public appearances, performances, guests, and people coming together for a larger cause. Yet online attention shifted toward a tiny moment on the red carpet. A hand movement, a step, a smile, a person briefly appearing behind another person. That was enough to create a debate. And that tells us something about celebrity culture. When public figures become this famous, their smallest movements can become stories. The camera does not need a dramatic argument. It does not need a public accusation. It does not even need dialogue. Sometimes all it needs is a perfectly timed frame. And once that frame reaches social media, millions of people can build their own explanation around it. So perhaps the real question is not, did David Foster snub Meghan Markle? Perhaps the better question is, how much can we really know from a few seconds of red carpet footage? David's explanation gives us one piece of the puzzle. The footage gives us another. Katharine's presence adds another layer. The history surrounding these people adds context. But none of those pieces automatically gives us a complete picture. And that is why this story remains open to interpretation. One viewer can watch the footage and see absolutely nothing unusual. Another can watch it and immediately notice the awkward positioning. Someone else can focus on David's expression. Another person can focus on Katharine, and someone else will focus entirely on Meghan's arm movement. Everyone is looking at the same footage, but they are not necessarily seeing the same story. That is the strange power of body language controversies. They feel objective because the camera captured them, but the meaning we attach to those movements is often subjective, and that is exactly why we should be careful. The footage can tell us what happened physically. It cannot automatically tell us why it happened. So, was Meghan Markle publicly rejected by David Foster? The evidence presented here does not establish that. David's explanation provides a reasonable alternative. The greeting had already happened, and the moment captured by cameras was simply part of the movement and positioning on the red carpet. But did the Katharine McPhee moment look awkward? Absolutely. And that awkwardness explains why the story did not disappear after David's explanation. Instead, the internet found a new question. Why did Meghan appear to move into that space? Was she helping with the photograph? Was she responding to photographers? Was Katharine simply caught behind her? Or was there something else going on? We cannot know from those few seconds alone. In the end, we are left with three things: a viral clip, an explanation that challenges the original interpretation, and another piece of footage that creates a completely different question. There is no confirmed feud, no proven romantic scandal, and no definitive evidence of deliberate disrespect in the footage itself. What we have is a few seconds of ambiguous red carpet footage that became much bigger than the moment itself. And perhaps that is the real lesson from this entire episode. A camera can capture a movement, but it cannot automatically capture the meaning behind that movement. David Foster may have simply been moving into position after already greeting Meghan and Harry. Meghan may have simply been helping organize the photograph. Katherine may have been caught behind Meghan at exactly the wrong moment, or the interaction may genuinely have felt awkward to the people watching it. The footage alone cannot give us certainty, but that uncertainty is exactly what made this moment explode online. One frame made Meghan appear rejected, another made her movements the subject of scrutiny. David's explanation challenged the first narrative, while Katherine's appearance created a second one. So, what do you think? Do you believe David Foster really snubbed Meghan Markle, or was the viral clip taken completely out of context? Was Meghan simply directing the group for the cameras? And did Katharine McPhee just happen to disappear behind Meghan at the worst possible second? Watch the footage carefully, look at the full sequence rather than one frozen frame, and decide for yourself. Because on a red carpet, the camera does not need a conversation to create a story.